行こう。今ちょうど見てるとこだ。
よろしくお願いします。
目移りするだろう。
お疲れ様です。
今ちょうど見て
では
るとこだ。
休憩の時間ですけど、どうしますか？
目移りするだろう。
Unit 207 has once again criminally and illegally shut off the live stream, and now they're preventing me from being able to visually see this live stream on the Lenovo ThinkPad. When I'm clicking on the live that says is currently recording, it bounces me to the preceding live stream they criminally and illegally shut off after it ran for less than 40 minutes. This time, 2 females are to blame for the preceding live stream. This time, 2 females are to blame for the preceding live stream. Okay. So it is now 8:43 p.m. PST. Unit 207 has criminally and illegally fucked with 5 different live streams since 7:55 p.m. PST, which they will be charged for. 5 different live streams since 7:55 p.m. PST, which they will be charged for. In the preceding live stream, I went over everything that we need to go over. In the preceding live stream, I went over everything that we need to go over. In the preceding live stream, I went over. Now, that being said, we can go over it all again, but I'm just going to play the preceding live stream. And I'm going to assume, based on the imbecilic behavior of the criminals upstairs in an aggravated criminal conspiracy / domestic terrorism organization / criminal enterprise, that their behavior from yesterday, where they criminally and illegally shut off over 23 or 24 live streams, is now resurging now that it's the evening. They're a bit pissy about the updates, which are accurate and have already been read and recorded in the preceding live stream. So again, as I stated, I am simply going to play the preceding live stream, which covers everything. Remember, in the event that this live stream ends for any reason without me orally telling you the end time, that I didn't end it, that Unit 207 did, and also as of today, they're hacking the ability to initiate live streams. That's a new one. Such busy little bees. Such busy little bees, man, I tell you what. So, before I get to playing that recording that I already played, let's make sure there is still audio. I'll get a screenshot of the title once Unit 207 allows it to function. Okay. Just like was the case with the preceding live stream, I have zero intention to end this live stream until it's ran for like 11 hours. Unit 207 has different ideas. And as stated previously, the female federal felons upstairs were to blame for the preceding live stream being criminally and illegally shut off. I am currently seeing 242 videos on the YouTube live stream set for public consumption, Nerd Squad, and as you know and I know, that's the incorrect count. I am now going to the preceding live stream that they criminally and illegally shut off that ran for, it says here, 37 minutes and 47 seconds, and when I click on it, it says it ran for 36. So I'm going to fast forward through the parts where I tell you that this is a consensual recording. With the females upstairs for all of that. There we go. My front door remained closed, obviously, and currently, once again, Unit 207 is preventing this live stream from registering viewers while the male stalkers upstairs. Unit 207 is preventing this live stream from registering to prison for the rest of their lives. We do have some updates, so I'll quickly go over those. Let me first adjust the title of this. Remember, this is a consensual recording of Mystic Gwen pursuant to the instructions of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I am not an employee of the FBI, but
a female hacker upstairs is saying, see, she's already trying to terminate
this
again.
Because some of the charges some of you will
Fall
be facing
back,
will
lady.
be to do with that status. And because some of the charges some of you will be facing will be to do
Also,
with
why
that
is that
status.
old crow upstairs at 8:47 p.m. on a Wednesday night?
So it appears we do have audio. So here are the updates that we need to go over. before we play a recording per the instructions of the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Again, the time is now
Oh, it looks like
8:47 p.m.
Criminally and illegally got rid of the previous updates. So let me go to the appropriate place where I should
criminally
have
and
those,
illegally got rid of
which would be the live stream that preceded this that I did indeed end on my own. Criminally and illegally got rid of, which would be the live stream selfie of myself from last month too. Here we go. Oh, they erased it from this one too. Such busy bees. Hang on a second here. It looks like they criminally illegally somehow got rid of the preceding live stream altogether. It's no longer reflecting on my studio. Yes, it's not reflecting at all. 2:12, 4:47 a.m., 2:12, 4:34 a.m. What's not reflecting is the preceding live stream. So let me refresh that because it did indeed have the updates in it. Refreshing my YouTube channel tab, Nerd Squad, which shouldn't have any issues, but Unit207, of course, causing issues. Scrolling down, 7, of course, causing issues. Okay, now magically I can see it. It's magically appeared. Okay, here are those updates. 2:12, 7:51 p.m. update. Unit207. From noon on, female felons going to prison have high expectations for next week and further crimes. Feels, quote, court, unquote, will bode well, as it apparently did not for some of their co-conspirators who are even more excited for next week. And then other than that, the rest of the updates you've already been made aware of. And that is due to the preceding live stream, which already addressed those. We are going to play a recording. Again, it is currently 8:07 p.m. PST. Unit207 criminally and illegally prevented over 5 different live streams from initiating.
And then they criminally and illegally shut off this one you're
So
listening
I'm adding
to.
that in here for the updates
It's
at
now
8:07 p.m.
8:50 p.m.
from 7:56 p.m. to 8:02 p.m. to male hackers upstairs.
It was a couple broads this last time. This is the time before the last time
Prevented
that you're listening to a recording of.
4 lives from launching. If you missed it because of their rampant crime spree yesterday, I am still recording.
Oh, yes. In that preceding live stream, you can see the Lenovo ThinkPad
and it's 8:08.
in the 15-plus hour-long
Wednesday,
footage.
February 12th. And
That's on the 2/12,
this video has
8:02
been
p.m.
recording
live
for
stream.
15 hours and 3 minutes. As you can see on the right there. It's offline. And this is the live stream that we are watching right now and recording. Do we still have audio? And this is the live stream that we are watching right now and recording. Do we still have audio? Do we still have audio? And this is the live stream. We do.
We do.
Now, other than those updates, which are listed in the description with a bit more detail, if you're curious about the days prior than that, we need to go over a recording that I no longer have access to because of Unit207's crime spree from yesterday, but I do have access to this preceding live stream from the 10th, and 5 minutes into it for the 15 minutes there is the recording that I need to play. So enjoy. It's 8:09 p.m. PST. Remember, if
That is most pertinent.
if this live stream ends for any reason without my oral statement that I'm ending it with the end time and that a commencing live stream will be initiating in 90 seconds or less, that Unit207 criminally and illegally ended it. Again, if you don't see a photo, you'll know that that's the case. And do keep in mind that they did that to 20-something yesterday.
And they just did that to 4 that I attempted to launch. 2 males upstairs squabbling back and forth with their hacking to try and get it to launch. And remember, this is the 8:02 p.m. live stream. You're watching the 8:41 p.m. live stream. 2 females ended the 8:02 p.m. live stream. It's now 8:52 p.m. Pay attention to the next 15 minutes of recording from February 10th, but do keep in mind, it is February 12th. It is 8:10 p.m. PST. Again, this is a consensual
8:53 p.m. PST now.
The Federal Bureau of Investigation. For those of you who aren't familiar, that's who has jurisdictional authority, because the crimes that you perpetrated in your aggravated criminal conspiracy in your domestic terrorist organization, which some of you have the audacity to refer to as an operation, has indeed been nothing more than a criminal enterprise from its inception. And everyone, less one single officer that I reported in 2017 for threatening everything you fools have made actionable, is involved, according to the FBI, you stupid sacks of shit.
Verified.
Now, keep in mind, they have such high hopes for next week. If I took anything Unit207 said seriously, I would be assuming I was going to deal with another breaking and entering in a final actionable county domestic terrorism, resulting in all of their asses being cut in a final county earlier than March. Okay. Oh, listen to this recording.
Part 2, which is under 20, after the third addendum to February's judicial notice / police reports, and that went up on Saturday.
I'm just explaining to you what the recording is
Actually,
you're
I
about
think
to hear.
it was Saturday. So I'm going to play you
The
a
February
recording
8th
now that only covers the
Addendum / police
addendum
report.
/ police report.
The
from
FBI wants you to
Saturday.
listen to it because the FBI says
Not
it's
the one
going
that
to be
came
following you
the
knuckleheads
4th,
around until you're
of
arraigned.
February, but that is available if you go to my YouTube live stream channel. You will see a video from this past Saturday, February 8th, which literally is titled Part 2 PT space II. Which literally is titled the North American, the fraudsters, the stalker, and I couldn't quite fit the extortionist into the title. And you're going to want to click on that, even though it looks like it runs for almost 12 hours. You just need to listen to the first 45 minutes therein. But right now, the FBI has me under orders to play this 15-minute recording that I'm about to push play on. And I need to pop over to the preceding live stream and add a selfie because I didn't need to end it. So pay attention. Happy Monday. The Welcome Tammys had plans for today. I wonder if they still do in their desperation. Remember, these attorneys facing federal disbarment, they won't take no for an answer as far as somebody else bringing it into my house, because they're all about they won't take no big charges, which is multiple felonies. Every one of them is looking at for their planning, facilitating, premeditation, etc. Well, it's going to turn into aggravated kidnapping charges. Multiple counts of those for all of you. On February 23rd, if you don't look, we'll undo everything you've done and paid in full, and we all know you won't be doing that.
Yes, we know that.
So you will be.
That's why the FBI had to tell you in December you were going to jail in March, unless your actions make that one
You
soon.
walk away from my private property like you fools have been told every single month for 17 months.
And then they had me reiterate it, didn't they, on February 8th?
Verified.
Yeah, they did.
We are
Verified.
going to do a recording of the latest addendums.
Happy Hump Day.
I'm not recording this one on Twitter since we know that Unit207 has completely destroyed that as well as their ongoing power and obstruction of justice.
And remember, you're personally liable, past, present, future. It doesn't matter that you got bamboozled by your fellow co-conspirators. It doesn't matter that you were set up as a patsy.
Standard time.
Personally liable, absolute lab.
Original filing February 4th, 2025. 10:08 a.m. PS 2025. Previous addendums February 6th, 2025, 7 a.m. PST. February 7th, 2025, 1:45 p.m. EST to Snohomish County Superior Court, North Everett Precinct, Snohomish County Sheriff's Office, Snohomish County Prosecutors, et al., and forwarded to FBI. From Lynette Renee Hansen, aka Mystic Plan. Supplemental information regarding further criminal activities, escalation of threats, evidence tampering, continued child abuse, and incurred penalties. February 8th, 2025. Demand for immediate action and notice of intent to seek maximum penalties.
Maximum penalties.
Maximum penalties is the third addendum to the formal judicial notice.
Well cooked hammies.
Well cooked hammies.
And previously supplemented. It provides further crucial information regarding subsequent events, the continued escalation of the criminal conspiracy, the blatant and
So
ongoing.
here, one moment, guys. I want you to say this with me. Ready, class? Ready? Say with me. You were never part of an operation. You've been a member of a domestic terrorist organization, a criminal enterprise, and are actively engaging ongoing in an aggravated criminal conspiracy. If you
Verified.
have not blown the whistle and you are still following unlawful directives, you are going to prison.
Verified.
You are a domestic terrorist. Okay, now back to the recording class. Domestic terrorist.
Ongoing obstruction of justice, the endangerment of my children.
Hey, but not till March.
further acts of retaliation.
Jail and the
And
arraignment
the
come in
approval
March.
of
Unless you make it come
additional
sooner.
penalties
Like next
against
week?
those
On that note, I added another update to the updates in the description regarding the preceding live stream. So let's do a quick little reading of those. 2:12, 8:57 p.m. Female felons caught tamper 8:02 p.m. live 2. 2:12, 8:07 p.m. 7:56 p.m. to 8:02 p.m. 2 male hackers upstairs prevented 4 lives from launching. 7:51 p.m. update. Unit 207 from noon on. Female felons going to prison have high expectations for next week and further crimes. Feels, quote, court, unquote, will bode well, as it apparently did not for some of their co-conspirators, who are even more excited for next week. 9:02 a.m. Unit 207 shuts off prior live. 2:12, 6:43 a.m. to 7:43 a.m. Unit 207 full in conspirators planning / excitement. Men and women still up there at 7:44 a.m. 2:12 dual recording offline on Lenovo due to 211 crimes. Unit 207 has illegally shut off 23 lives from 8 a.m. to 5:16 p.m. on 211. A male from their unit was outside stalking me at 5:20 before entering their balcony door. Again, you can see that 15 plus hour long recording going on my Lenovo ThinkPad in the preceding live stream that's titled 2:12, 8:02 p.m. NEP, Unit 207, Prosecutor, et al. Conspiracy, fraud, etc. Exposed. Prison. Millions. Inevitable.
those perpetrating these crimes. This addendum also serves as a full police report documenting these new crimes. 1. Incorporation of prior filings by reference. All facts, invoices, statements, and incorporated documents referenced in the original formal judicial notice of February 4th, 2025, the addendums of February 6th and 7th, 2025, and all police reports filed by Lynette Renee Hansen from June 2024 to the present date, and any future date are hereby incorporated by reference as if set forth herein. This specifically includes, but is not limited to, Declaration of Lynette Renee Hansen, aka Mystic Gwen, dated December 14th, 2024, revised 8:07 p.m. PST, due to unlawful tampering. Addendum to Declaration dated December 19th, 2024. Addendum and amendment to Declaration dated December 29th, 2024. Tort claim filed August 14th, 2024, case number 10500594, served on the North Everett Precinct, Snohomish County Prosecutors et al. This document details planned felonies, named conspirators, prior child abuse, and plans for super felonies. The dated signage reference within and photographs for that last page predated even that filing. It is to be noted for that court claim, those named within it and their co-conspirators had planned to not only have the actionable kidnappings take place between my multiple times convicted stalker and abuser and my extortionist mother, but they also, and I quote, had quote, super felonies planned. All reports filed.
Welcome, Tammy.
24 by me, Lynette Renee Hansen,
Honey
aka Mystic Plan. 2. Correction to the previous addendum from February 7th, 2025. Any reference to the February 7th, 2025 addendum to January 4th, 2025 is hereby corrected to read February 4th, 2025 at 10:08 a.m. PST. 3. Supplemental information, subsequent criminal acts investigation. A. Status of front door in illegal detention. My front door has remained continuously closed and locked since January 2nd, 2025, per explicit FBI instructions.
Per explicit FBI instructions.
Entry on January 29th, 2025, perpetrated by my disabled sons and illegally kidnapped sons under the direction of this criminal conspiracy.
Under the direction of the
FBI
criminal
has instructed me to
conspiracy.
keep my door closed until the perpetrators are apprehended or until they attempt another illegal entry.
That's right.
As of today, February 8th, 2025, I have
I just want you to focus on what I just said. My door is to stay closed until you're apprehended or your next count of breaking and entering. Your
Verified.
criminal enterprises next count. According to the FBI, you're already at 2. They are counting Officer Porky Pig, Peekaboo. Back to the recording.
Have you seen that live
direction
stream?
of this criminal conspiracy. The FBI has instructed me to keep my door closed until the perpetrators are apprehended or until they attempt another illegal entry. As of today, February 8th, 2025, I have been illegally detained within my own residence for 184 days since August 6, 2024. B. February 7th, 2025, evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and continued threats. Live stream interference. While preparing and filing the previous addendum and police report on February 7th, 2025, individuals associated with Unit207 criminally and illegally terminated 4 separate YouTube live streams. They also retroactively erased over 1 hour of footage from certain recordings. These actions constitute blatant evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and witness intimidation. It is strongly suspected that these actions were taken to either A. create a false impression of personal service or my voluntary exit from my residence, or B. to conceal evidence of their planning and preparation for their next planned break-in and other felonies. 12:50 p.m. Knocking. Individuals associated with Unit207 engaged in aggravated stalking, harassment, and criminal trespass. February 8th, 2025, 5:30 a.m. PST, confirmation of imminent break-in. As of approximately 5:30 a.m. PST on February 8th, 2025, the male in Unit207 confirmed plans for an imminent break-in involving numerous officers from the North Everett Precinct. This is consistent with the ongoing threats and plans that have been documented for over a year and specifically reported to the North Everett Precinct, Snohomish County Prosecutors, and others. The conspirators in Unit207 have stated that this needs to occur prior to February 23rd because the attorneys involved, at least 2 of whom are facing federal disbarment, are aware that this conspiracy will result in additional and more serious charges being filed. D. Prior knowledge and warnings. It is crucially emphasized that the North Everett Precinct, the Snohomish County Prosecutor's Office, DCYF, and named individuals, including Richard Garcia and Erica Owens, have been repeatedly warned about the illegal activities and consequences thereof. These warnings include 11 months in business letters directly sent to the involved parties in the revolving cast of third, fourth, and fifth parties, beginning in September 2023. 11 months prior to their illegal premeditated felonies in August 2024. August 7th and August 13th, 2024. Signage. Dated, signed, photographed, and included in the August 14th, 2024 tort claim were placed on my property, explicitly addressed to the North Everett Precinct. DOS. Richard Garcia, DCYF and Unit 207, prohibiting trespassing, knocking without a warrant, stalking, and other criminal activities. These signs were in addition to signs that had been in place for over a year prior, and that the FBI had me add them to the last. And the FBI had me added to the last page of the August 14th, 2024 tort claim. August 14th, 2024 tort claim. This document was made after 11 months since business letters failed to do anything, and the kidnapping, illegal detainment, etc. were planned for the weeks after. This document detailed the planned felonies, named the conspirators, and outlined the financial penalties for their actions, including their defenses, i.e. obstruction / conspiracy / etc. Numerous police reports, repeatedly filed police reports documenting the ongoing threats and criminal activities have been consistently detected by the North Everett Precinct, including before their actionable kidnappings reported for weeks to months prior, published about in December 2023 on my personal Twitter account, x.com/realnessbefriend. During communication, all conspirators except Erica and John Owens were explicitly informed beginning August 2024 that I was not authorized to communicate with them, read anything from them, or cooperate with them in any way. The Owens were informed shortly after their involvement in the second actionable kidnapping. Per the FBI's instructions, cease and desist letters and August 14th tort claim filed in case number 10-500-5934. Despite these warnings, the conspirators have sent over 48 individuals to my door and engaged in constant exterior stalking. Just since the first week of August, they did the same thing for the 11 months prior when they were getting cease and desist letters. The involvement of Everett Public School District. The potential involvement of the Everett Public School District, an institution with which I have a long and positive relationship as a art-based special ed para-volunteer, enhanced teaching volunteer, and donor, is noted with grave concern. This highlights the sprawling nature of the conspiracy and its willingness to corrupt and exploit various institutions.
Verified.
I volunteered for an average of 40 hours a week from 2012/2013 to the start of 2020 and donated tens of thousands to the school district. Podcast interference. Unit 207 and or their co-conspirators have blocked my podcast from being uploaded to Spotify, iHeartRadio, and Audible. They're also at x.com while all access via my dedicated podcast Twitter, x.com/mysticwinpod. I will create a YouTube live stream part 2 of my prior, titled Mystic Win versus the North Everett Precinct for Fraudsters, the Stalker, the Extortionist, and all by 8 p.m. PST today. I'm going to pause out there and just reiterate that video was already uploaded because the recording you're listening to is from the day that it was filed, the 8th, 2 days ago. So part 2 is the third video that precedes this. It's titled 5:20 p.m. PT space 2 Mystic Land versus the North Everett Precinct of Fraudsters, Stalker, and then remember.
At 9:11 p.m., the female federal felons upstairs that are deemed going to prison already have plans to criminally and illegally shut off this live stream when I go to sleep. Don't do that, you evil
FBI
cunts.
timeline and intent. The FBI informed me in December 2024 of their plans to incarcerate officers involved in the conspiracy in March 2025. Subject to change.
Hey, it's not March 2025, guys. It's February 12th.
Verified.
Isn't it? Isn't it? Yes. Yes, it is. Actually recording.
change based on the conspirators' actions. Unit 207 statements indicate they believe they have no alternative but to pursue their planned illegal entry, arrest, committal, or kidnapping before February 23rd. As the involved attorneys are aware of the increased severity of charges they will face after that date. 4. Financial penalties updated. Following financial penalties previously invoiced and contractually agreed upon are reiterated and updated. 100,000 per day for each day of my ongoing illegal detention, now totaling over 180 days. 10 million for any attempted illegal entry into my residence, increased to 25 million if I am asleep at the time. This penalty applies to the recent breaking and entering on January 29th, 2025. After million of 10 million for the use of my sons and or for forcing them to commit any illegal acts, including the January 29th breaking and entering. Doubling of all penalties of fraudulent orders are used in conjunction with any illegal act. Quadrupling of these fees for any of the above criminal acts that are perpetrated within 7 days of a rejected police report regarding said acts. 2 million for the rejection of legitimate police reports constituting obstruction of the rejection of legitimate police reports to date. 10 million for each instance of illegally terminating a YouTube live stream. This applies to all instances to date. 10 million for each and every instance of stalking. 10 million for each and every instance of harassment. 10 million for each and every instance of ADA violations. 10 million for each and every instance of civil rights violations. 10 million for the incident of stalking, harassment, ADA violations, criminal trespass, and witness intimidation on February 7th, 2025 at 12:50 p.m. Additional penalties for February 7th events subject to quadrupling. The 40,000 for the knocking, or the 40 million for the knocking, and 40 million for the obstruction based on the 2 rejected reports. Additional penalties for live stream terminations, 4 terminations times 10 million equals 40 million. The actions documented in this addendum and those rejected in prior reports significantly increase the financial liability of the conspirators. 5. Conclusion. This addendum provides further irrefutable evidence of the aggravated and ongoing criminal conspiracy targeting me, a designated FBI informant. The individuals involved, including officers of the North Everett Precinct, members of the Snohomish County Prosecutor's Office, occupants of Unit 207, and their expanded network of co-conspirators demonstrates a complete and utter disregard for the law, for my rights, and for the well-being of my children. Their attempts to obstruct justice, tamper with evidence, and intimidate a federal witness are not only failing but are actively strengthening the case against them. Verified. The FBI.
Verified.
Or anyone speaking to the perjurous and fraudulent proclamation that any of their actions were, quote, reactive and not the premeditated, illegal, and consistently reported felonies that they were and are, will be the recipients of the longest prison sentences. Verified. Federal Bureau of Investigation is fully aware. Fully aware. This document serves as formal legal notice of these crimes and demand for immediate action to protect my safety and ensure accountability. Sincerely, Lynette Renee Hansen, aka Mystic Gwen. Date February 8th, 2025. Time 7:12 a.m.
Okay, it is actually 9:16 p.m. PST, February 12th, Wednesday, 2025. I've added a new update while that was playing to the description here. I've added 2:12, 9:11 p.m. Female felons upstairs plan to terminate this live while I sleep. Maybe typing it will prevent their crime spree / stalking / tampering / intimidation, etc. without immunity. Maybe not, but maybe. And on that note, I'm going to flip this around and show you what I already showed you in the preceding live stream. Here's the Lenovo ThinkPad. This is the laptop the FBI has designated me to use, aside from this one, which runs the live streams. So I'm just going to minimize this and show you that offline recording that's become necessary because of their crimes. Yeah, there's the Lenovo ThinkPad recording. It's been running for 16 hours. I won't be turning it off while I go to sleep. And darling, if you terminate this live stream, I promise you I will liquidate your ass so fast before you are sentenced after your arraignment. So fast.
Began to evacuate their entire town by a gate.
Primarily because I plan on going to sleep, and also I don't like child abusers and I don't like stalkers, and I especially do not like domestic terrorists.
Skip takeout and enjoy deals on produce, proteins, quick meals, snacks, and more.
You're professional disgraces.
Shop in-store or online today.
That's all you are. You are child abusers, stalkers, hostage holders, thieves, fraudsters, and disgraces to every man and woman in the enforcement community and every public servant as well. It's 9:18 p.m. PST. I wanted to go to sleep until I heard that annoying cunt.
Hello, and welcome to the Pirate History Podcast. My name is Matt. Thank you for listening. While Francis Drake was on his voyage of circumnavigation around the globe, he had really no news of England or European politics. No news of the ever-heightened
Are we still connected at 9:18
He must have
p.m.?
had some notion of this since his piracy and raiding were directly responsible.
Are we still connected at 9:18 p.m.? Looks like we are.
He had no news. It was really impossible for him to hear anything of either the Queen of England or the many Catholic plots against her. When he finally sailed in Plymouth Harbor in September 1580, his very first question was asked after the Queen.
Remember, everybody, there's very few absolutes in this life, and you've got absolute lack of immunity, past, present, future.
Immediately after returning to England, he sent word to court of his return and his adventures, his trials, his exploits, and his treasure.
Independent whistleblowers excluded. Remember, those of you that tried to give a sales pitch to the FBI, all you did was make them all the more interested in prosecuting you.
It had been drawn up for their eyes, and they argued bitterly over whether or not to sign it to appease the King of Spain. Now, some of these privy councillors argued that the treasure should be locked up in the Tower of London, perhaps along with Francis Drake, to await return to King Philip. Others, including Lords Leicester, Walsingham, and Hatton, well, they refused to sign this order. They were, after all, financial backers of Drake's voyage, and they stood to lose a fortune if the treasure were returned. Now, all this bickering was really ultimately pointless. These men were powerful and influential, but Elizabeth was queen. She sent personally a missive to Francis Drake, summoning him to court, asking that he please bring a sample of the treasure from his adventure. For 6 hours, the two met in private council. Drake certainly reported about the trial.
I'm going to bed, and I'm taking you with me, you cuddly little fur puff, even though you abandoned me. You abandoned me in the bed and come out here.
Important geographic discoveries. His conquest of Nova Albion and his exploration of the potential western edge of the Northwest Passage. However, perhaps most notable to the Queen were the trade deals that Drake had struck between the English and the Malacca Islands. These ensured future profit and goods from the East Indies. This future income, not to mention the windfall of Spanish gold and silver, must have been a balm to Elizabeth. I imagine she told Drake this, as she described the dire situation. She would have told him of the Cold War in the Netherlands that was threatening ever to break out into a firefight. She would have told him, certainly, about the death of the King of France and the raising of the new king, Henry III, which didn't bode well for England, seeing as how Henry III is so closely tied to Mary Queen of Scots. In addition to that, there were several plots on Elizabeth's life personally, as well as many Scottish plots to see her executed or overthrown. Beyond that, Ireland was a constant problem. The Spanish, French, and all the Catholic forces of Europe continued to use Ireland as a thorn in Elizabeth's side, fomenting rebellion there. There was a plot where not only were the local Irish Catholic lords...
Okay, Unit 207, stalkers, criminal conspiracy, domestic terrorist organization. Stay out of my fucking house, keep the live stream on, and pay attention to your own hands.
Severely in England.
What your hands are
All men
doing
with older names and
that
greater
you're so
titles,
readily going
lords
to
of the
prison
Admiralty.
for.
It was to Francis Drake that Elizabeth turned again and again in her war with the Spanish. And after she had given him his rewards, she would send him back out on the open ocean. This is episode number 13. The world is not enough. On April 1st, 1581, the Golden Hind, Francis Drake's ship, traveled to Deptford for the Queen and all of London to see the ship that had traveled around the globe. The quay was filled with hundreds of onlookers, hoping to catch a glimpse of the captain that they all adored. Drake was not just a captain and not just a soldier, but he was really a celebrity in England. He was a man who was not unlike the common people, and he had been able to tell Philip exactly what he could do with his empire, with his pope, and with his ships. With the Golden Hind at anchor, Queen Elizabeth ascended the gangplank to view the Golden Hind, and the crowd thronged the plank after her, collapsing it and them into the mudflats below. The crowd laughed and cheered at the antics of these people trying to escape. Now they were unharmed, but they must have been covered with blood. The Queen, who was ever the entertainer herself, lost one of her garters, which a man who was gallant and dashing, the French ambassador, Monsieur de Marchemont, collected it for her. In front of all of the onlookers, in fact, all of London, the Queen raised her skirts to replace the garter, and she told Marchemont coyly that when she was done with it, she would give it to him as a gift. Now that the crowd had been awed by the ship, amused by these people's antics, and just a little bit titillated by the Queen, it was time for formalities. Francis Drake kneeled before the Queen, and she raised her gilded sword above her head, asking the audience if she should strike off Francis Drake's head. The crowd, of course, bellowed a resounding no. The Queen bowed her head to them, passed her sword to Monsieur Marchemont, and asked him to perform the ceremony of knighthood on Francis Drake. She was going to need him. He was her new knight. He was her dragon. All of the things that she had told Francis Drake, be it the situation in the Netherlands, the rebellions in Scotland, the open rebellion in Ireland, or the many plots against Elizabeth's life, they were all backed by the Spanish. Be it financially, or with spies, or even with soldiers, the Spanish were behind everything. Spain was growing ever more powerful, too. While Francis Drake had been on his voyage in the year 1578, there was a battle on the shore of Morocco called the Battle of the Three Kingdoms. There, King Sebastian of Portugal was killed. His elderly uncle, a deaf and blind old man named Cardinal Enrico, was raised to the throne. Now, it's arguable that he didn't have the best claim. In fact, both Catherine de' Medici and Philip II had more legitimate and better claims than him. However, Philip bided his time. He didn't want to be seen overthrowing an old man. And when the cardinal inevitably eventually died, Philip ordered the Iron Duke, the Duke of Alva, into Portugal. Now, most of the rural country in Portugal fell almost immediately, but Lisbon held out for their king, a man who was the bastard nephew of Cardinal Enrico, a man named Dom Antonio. Now, Antonio was not a legitimate claimant to the throne. However, really, Portugal had nobody else to put forward. The throne was likely to go to either a French woman or the Spanish king himself, and that was something the Portuguese just couldn't stomach, seeing a foreign monarch sitting on their throne, so they supported this man, Don Antonio, fiercely. In Lisbon, the fighting was urban fighting, soldiers with spears, arrows, and swords in the streets, going home to home, killing anybody who stood against them. It was bloody, and it was violent, and it was terrible, but finally, the forces supporting Don Antonio were defeated, and on September 12th, 1580, Philip II was named King of Portugal. He sent a letter to Alva thanking him, saying, quote, "I don't know how to express the gratitude I owe you for this." End quote. Spain had been, up until now, the richest and the largest empire in the world. With the Empire of Portugal added, with her possessions in Brazil, parts of Africa, and the greatest European holdings in Asia, Spain was now a truly global empire, the largest that the world had ever seen. After taking Lisbon, Philip found 12 very pleasing surprises. He found 12 brand new galleons ready to sail. The Portuguese galleon was really the greatest warship in the world, and these 12 had more guns, more men, and more sail than any other ships in Europe. With these, Philip could really crush the sea-bangers. He could cripple this new English navy and, hopefully, reclaim the Mediterranean from the Turks. In land, in wealth, and now in naval power, they eclipsed England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire combined. They were now the world's only superpower. and Philip's eyes were trained directly on English shores. Now, he wanted to avoid open war with Elizabeth, but he supported every Catholic plot against her and her nation. But despite their superiority, Philip was quickly growing to be rivaled in naval power by the English. The Portuguese, who had become sort of allies with the English, had shared their design of the galleon with Elizabeth. John Hawkins, who was now the treasurer of the Navy, had been tasked with building England's fleet up. He went to work constructing these Elizabethan ships, this version of the Portuguese galleon. Now, the first ship completed bore a name that would become forever a defining trait of the Royal Navy. They called that first galleon Dreadnought. By the time Francis Drake was back in England, they had completed several other ships, including the Revenge, the Scout, and work was progressing on even more English galleons. It's worth taking a second to look at exactly what a galleon is and why it is such a vast improvement on former English vessels like the Caravel, or even those ships like the Jesus of Lubbock, which had really massive fore and aft castles. If you picture those old-time medieval ships that have massive constructs on the back of them that look so imposing on the waves, well, that was what the old ships were like, and while they looked so domineering, they were really ungainly on the sea. These galleons, they had a smaller fore and aft castle, and they had a much longer keel relative to their width, which really made them extremely swift and very maneuverable. So in addition to the stability by shortening the fore and aft castles, they had been given a much longer keel, which really let them cut through the water, and almost more importantly, these warships, it gave them a whole lot more room for guns. Now, while the Portuguese and the Spanish and the English and perhaps the French were all now building these galleons, it was really in those guns where the English excelled. For years, perhaps decades in Europe, it had been agreed by every navy that the only proper material to build a cannon out of was bronze. Bronze guns were far superior to their precursors, the iron guns, in both their weight, their durability, and the lack of probability to explode on deck and kill all of the men on board. They were able to take the concussions from these explosions much better. Bronze guns were extremely expensive, though, and they were difficult to produce. The Spanish and the Portuguese relied almost exclusively on the German foundries making these bronze guns. The English, unfortunately, were unable to buy any more of these bronze guns. Due to the war in the Netherlands, they had had their trade cut off primarily with the continent, so they had to do something radical to produce their own guns. So John Hawkins turned to an old source. All the way back in the reign of Henry VIII, the king had turned to the foundries in Sussex in England and told them to start working on producing new guns, not made of bronze, but made of cast iron. Now, this was agreed by all the navies to be inferior. However, he told them to develop a gun that could take these concussions and was less likely to break and also extremely maneuverable on board a ship. When John Hawkins turned to them, he found that while their guns were still inferior to the bronze guns, they were able to produce them much more safely than they had before and much more quickly and cheaply than anybody could produce bronze guns in Europe. These guns were lighter than their forebears, more maneuverable, and most importantly, capable of rolling from one side of the ship to the other. They were now built along extremely strict plans that were much more stable and less prone to destruction. These cast iron guns were all identical. All of the galleons they were building were also made by very specific plans that matched these new iron cannon. So you could fit so many of these guns on board that really looked like monsters bristling with thorns. These new English galleons had more firepower than any other ships in Europe, all due to these improvements on the iron cannon. So the Queen and John Hawkins now had all of these brand new ships with brand new guns, and the question remained, though, what exactly to do with this new and powerful navy. The ships that were owned by Drake and the Hawkins family and the Winter family continued their activities in and around Europe, that being primarily the North Sea and Channel, and in the West Indies. They would take prizes, they would take plunder, they would sack ships, and they would raid villages. But these were really nothing more than pinpricks to Spain's all-encompassing empire. They needed a true plan to showcase their naval might and to deal a real blow to King Philip of Spain, something that would make him stand up and take notice. This new navy was a big deal, and whatever their plan was going to be was discussed all around them. In lords' castles and tavern rooms, these armchair admirals would discuss exactly what should be done with this new navy. But the men who were really in charge of the navy, men like William Winter, John Hawkins and Francis Drake, well, they came up with many plans, and some of these plans they even planned out meticulously, down to where they would get all of their materials from. However, again and again, these plans were vetoed by sometimes the Privy Council, but more frequently by Elizabeth. Her new navy was expensive, and she didn't want to see it wasted in some reckless naval action. She needed proof to be convinced that whatever their plan was, it would go off without a hitch. The first and most audacious of these plans, to at least be seriously considered by the Privy Council Elizabeth, was brought to the council by Sir Francis Drake. Now, Drake had befriended and made an ally of that Don Antonio de Claro, that dethroned and exiled king of Portugal. The plan that they had come up with together was to attack the Spanish treasure fleet at the Azores, which was really the Portuguese loyalist stronghold. However, now Philip was using it as it was now part of his empire. This was a means not only to rob the King of Spain of all of the riches in his treasure fleet, but also to take back that stronghold for Don Antonio and perhaps lead a rebellion against the King of Spain. This would have stung him on 2 points very strongly, and it appealed to everyone in England, but it was imperfect for a number of reasons. First, being that it was risky and potentially disastrous. Elizabeth wanted something that was less probable to fail. The second being that this would be an open declaration of war with Spain. It would be allying with this Portuguese king in a civil war for the throne, which was something that, as yet, Elizabeth was not ready to consider. So Drake had other plans that he decided to bring to the attention of some of the more powerful men in England. This time, he went directly to the Earl of Leicester and pleaded with him for another mission. This was a voyage that Drake would plan and fund, but he would not actually lead himself. The plan was to go trade with that Sultan Babu in the East Indies that Drake had made that trade alliance with. The voyage was backed by Drake, and Leicester got behind it as well. After those two, Walsingham, Hatton, and Admiral Lincoln all got on board. In addition, that Muscovy Company and many of the other corporations in London got on board as well. It was quickly fully funded. Any operation backed by such a list of people had a lot of supporters. However, Drake wouldn't be on board, and that absence left sort of a power struggle to see who would actually lead this voyage. Drake had men that he thought would be best for it, but these were among his friends, people who were those rough West Country Englishmen that these nobles in London didn't think would be best for the voyage. Perhaps they should have listened to Drake in the long run, but eventually, the captain of the voyage went down to a man named Edward Fenton. Now, Fenton was a distinguished military man. However, most of his distinctions came from military actions on land. Really, he had almost no experience with the sea, which has proved in the past disastrous. And in the fleet that Drake was putting together, it showed. When Drake went to survey the ships, he found that every ship was light on tackle and line, and so he appointed several of his own trusted Marines to supervise the provision of these ships. Now, the council had gone over Drake's head to appoint Fenton, but Drake had every confidence that his own men who were on board each of these ships would see that the voyage went well and would return with a wealthy and resounding success. The voyage was a disaster. Almost immediately, Fenton found himself alienated from the more seasoned sailors, and in the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, he began to lose his mind. His men on board demanded that the fleet sail west rather than east to go back to the Strait of Magellan and plunder Peru as Drake had done that a year before. Fenton, who had quickly lost complete control of the men on board these ships, had really no command left, so he acquiesced to it. And when they reached Brazil after sailing west, it showed why a wise and competent commander like Francis Drake really was vital to a mission like this. The fleet attacked the very first Spanish ships that they came in contact with, 3 of them, and one of them they wound up sinking. So immediately, all of the ports in the region closed up shop and defended themselves with whatever guns and ships they had available. Now, Francis Drake, while he may have taken certain ships, he wouldn't have sunk them. He wouldn't have sunk the first ships he encountered. He would choose his prizes much more wisely. So the fleet is forced to flee back east, penniless, destitute, and Fenton, well, he raged at the men on board, and he demanded that they take the island of St. Helena. and also demanded that they name him king. He told the men that they could plunder every ship traveling to and fro the Cape of Good Hope, and they could build themselves a paradise. They did. The fleet returned to England. They were smaller and they were broken, and one of Drake's brothers, John Drake, had been left behind, never to be seen again. The mission was a disaster. The captain, that king of St. Helena, he was ushered into retirement quietly. Elizabeth seethed in court. In the 13 months that the doomed voyage had been gone, Philip had crushed the fleet of ships loyal to Don Antonio in the Azores. Now, this wasn't the English Navy, but these were allies to Elizabeth. And that wasn't the end of the bad news. William of Orange had been assassinated. The Duke of Parma in the Netherlands, who had taken the place of the Iron Duke, was even more merciless than Alfred had been, and Dutch independence was faltering. Elizabeth turned to Sir Walter Raleigh, who was her new favorite at court. She had given him the nickname Water, as she realized that she couldn't live without either. She asked him to found an American settlement at Rome, which was something that Raleigh and his brothers were eager to do. Now, as that settlement wasn't getting off to the best start, Elizabeth was forced to turn, once again, to her most powerful weapon. She planned to unleash her dragon. Now, Drake's plan hadn't worked out, but he hadn't been at the helm, so John Hawkins brought a plan that he had mentioned to Elizabeth before. He brought it back to her. This was a plan, simply, to go back to the West Indies and continue raiding. Now, he was fresh off a voyage that his family had been involved in that had gone extremely well. That wasn't an official Royal Naval voyage. A document from November 1584 shows the Queen, Sir Francis Drake, John and William Hawkins, and the Lords Leicester, Raleigh, and Hatton planning the voyage. Now, it was possible that they were planning the voyage to the Moluccas. This was something that hadn't happened on the last voyage because Fenton had lost control of the fleet. However, this voyage would not be so small. This would have 11 large ships, at least 4 barks, and 11 pinnaces, carrying at least 1,600 men. This was going to be an official English naval fleet, the largest ever commissioned by the Queen, and there was only really one choice for admiral. On Christmas Eve, 1584, Sir Francis Drake was named Admiral of the English fleet. Now, only a few days later, on December 31st, Philip II of Spain and the French royal family signed what is called the Treaty of Joinville, forming the European Catholic League against the Protestant forces of Elizabeth and the Netherlands and the French Huguenot forces. Now, Philip was nervous about Elizabeth's intentions and the rumors of her massed fleet. Since the Spanish ambassador, Mendoza, had been exiled in England, news was unreliable, and he wanted as strong an alliance in Europe as possible. Now that ambassador, who was in exile in Paris, did get occasional word of what was happening in England, and he sent Philip word of the amassing fleet, which was a confirmation of Philip's worst fears. Now, in only a few days' time, Philip received another message, this time from the Duke of Parma in the Low Countries, informing him that the English had cut off all trade with the Spanish Netherlands. The signs were clear that Elizabeth was no longer playing games with Spain. Now, Philip's highest military officials urged him to act. Both the Iron Duke of Alva and the Admiral of Santa Cruz pushed for open war with England. They encouraged him to take their ships, destroy Drake and his fleet, and invade English shores immediately. But Philip hesitated. Open war could still be a disaster, and Philip still had cards up his sleeve. I'd like to read a passage from historian Susan Rock. Quote, Lenovo, Spain, 6 p.m., Wednesday, May 26, 1585. Master Foster gazed upon Lenovo Hill, feasting his eyes on the fine sight of so many Londoners that had heeded the King of Spain's call for help. Philip II had invited English merchants to send cargoes of corn and assured the Queen's Majesty that people would have his very own assurance of safe conduct in these troubled times. Payment for the corn would be made by bills of exchange payable to the city of London and Antwerp at their market houses. And so, the Primrose, a 150-ton Londoner, had been stocked with nearly 20 tons of corn and several ells of broadcloth and set sail for Lenovo in Biscay. Master Foster had heard that the country was starving, that the whole of Iberia had had a harsh winter. Though the master of the Primrose and his men could be no firm judges of that fact for themselves, Lenovo had been bathed in warm sunshine for the past 2 days in port, and the Spaniards they had seen appeared to have been wealthy. Indeed, as Foster took in the near idyllic scene with the sun low in the sky, its rays reflecting lazily on the bay, Lenovo seemed a welcoming voice in the wind, as she had always been. It was then that he noted the soft groan of his rigging. A fine southwesterly was stirring. Foster prayed it would still be blowing the following day when they would weigh anchor and head for home. He hunched over the rail of his ship, leaning heavily on his arms, and looked on as a number of sleek Spanish pinnaces darted between his fellow lanterns. It was one of those rare moments of leisure for the captain of an English merchantman. Perhaps that was why he did not spy the pinnace heading for the Primrose. When the watch called out the approach of the Spanish vessel, and that there were 7 souls aboard, Foster awoke from his reverie and barked his orders to the crew, alerting them that a small party wished aboard. What the devil could they want this time of evening? The Primrose's cargoes had been unladen. It was most unusual for Spanish merchants to settle their bills of exchange at this time of day. Further, the master of the Primrose had already settled the matter of loading the Spanish lines for the return voyage the following day. It was a wary Foster who greeted the Corregidor of Biscay. The hale and hearty fellow presented Foster to the 6 other men as Biscayan merchants, and claimed that they wished to give him a small token of their esteem. They had brought a hamper full of fresh cherries as a gift, a favorite of the English queen, or so they had understood. Master Foster thanked them and ordered that beef, biscuit, and beer be brought to the impromptu gathering at his cabin. Yet, before they sat down to eat, 4 of the Biscayan merchants made their excuses and announced their intention to return to the shore aboard the Spanish pinnace. This lack of common civility made Foster truly smell danger. He ordered his first mate to accompany the Spaniards back on deck, simultaneously giving him the signal that all was not as it should be. It was a well-rehearsed exercise for English merchantmen in foreign waters, and the first mate knew how to alert the crew in secret to be ready for an assault. The master of the Primrose returned to his unwanted guests, laughing and joking with them in broken Spanish and English, noting all the while through the porthole the pinks and oranges of the setting sun, wondering undoubtedly if it would be his last sunset. After some 15 minutes, the watch called out again that the pinnace had returned, carrying more than 20 men, and that a larger vessel with perhaps as many as 70 merchants also followed. Foster silently prayed that God would be English this day. The master bade the Corregidor and his men to return to deck to greet the ships, expecting the worst. They were, after all, only 26 men against some 90 or more Spaniards. He could only imagine that these Biscayan merchants meant to board the Primrose, capture the crew, and at best imprison them all. Many a merchantman had been imprisoned before them, and most had fallen foul of the Inquisition. It was a destiny that he could not wish upon his enemies. Once above deck, Foster's suspicions were confirmed. Turning to the magistrate and his 2 friends, he said that he could not allow such a group of men to board his small ship, and the Corregidor nodded compliantly. Yet, before Foster could give his crew the final signal to repulse an attack, he heard the beat of the battle drums from the Spanish ship below, and the unmistakable sound of their swords being unsheathed. The thud of the grappling irons and the roar of the Biscayans wrestling alongside the Primrose to board her by force drowned out his orders to his men. The Corregidor and his merchants seized Foster with daggers drawn at his throat and cried out above the shouts of the melee, "Yield yourself, for you are the king's prisoner." Foster narrowed his eyes and bellowed back, "We are betrayed!" The crew of the Primrose had fortunately taken the defensive measures that her master had laid down for circumstances such as these. Within seconds, 5 calabiers were fired through the grates from below decks at the Spanish scuffling above. There were screams from those Biscayans who had legs blown off, and shouts to abandon their action from the others. They could not know it, but it was the only gunpowder and shot the Primrose had on board. But the few seconds of confusion the blast created was enough to turn the tide. Foster prized himself loose from his captors and gave the order to fight to the death. Many of the Biscayans fled back to the boarding vessels, fearing that they would be blown to smithereens, as several of their number had been seconds before. Others stood their ground. Hand-to-hand battle broke out, and the well-practiced English drill of a skirmish at sea ensued. The English, knowing that if they were forced from the ship they would die 1,000 slow deaths, fought like demons, possessed with boar spears and lances, which whipped through 2 to 3 Spaniards at a stroke. Yet, despite the heavy carnage on the Spanish side, the outcome of the battle remained in doubt for a time. The only certainty to Foster and his men was that the deck of the Primrose was stained red with the blood of the Spaniards and Englishmen. The fighting raged on for another half an hour, with many Spanish Biscayans butchered, flung overboard, or drowned before the English could claim victory. Amazingly, only one Englishman, John Tristan, had been killed. 6 other members of the crew were injured, but Foster thought that they would survive their wounds. He had to presume that his 2 men, John Burrell and John Broadbank, who had delivered the last of the corn cargo, had been taken into custody ashore. While the master and his crew made ready to set sail, Foster was perplexed why the Biscayan merchants who had escaped in the pinnaces did not bring reinforcements. He could not understand, at the moment of his own victory, why no armed relief to the corregidor had come. While he decided what should be done with the unfortunates struggling for their lives in the bay, Foster looked out across the harbor for the first time since the assault. All the other Londoners had the King of Spain's flag flying high on their masts. The Spanish treachery was now clear. The English ships had been lured into Spanish harbors for Philip II to confiscate and amass their piratical act and leave England helpless. End quote. Today's episode is brought to you by Factor. It's a new year, and a lot of us have made some pretty big promises to ourselves about losing weight and getting healthy. Well, Factor has chef-made gourmet meals that make it easy to eat well. They'll send you a box of fresh, fully prepared meals that are ready to heat and eat within 2 minutes. And Factor makes it easy to customize your meal plan. They have 40 different options across 8 different meal plans, and they switch it up every week, so you're always going to get something new. No, I won't receive my box for a couple more days, but I've worked with Factor before, and last time I did the keto meal plan. But they sent me this meal that had a cauliflower risotto that I still think about sometimes, and I've never been able to emulate. They've got other options like Calorie Smart or Protein Plus, but this time I'm just going with the chef's choice, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what they come up with. Get started at factormeals.com/pirate50off and use code pirate50off to get 50% off your first box, plus free shipping. That's code pirate50off at factormeals.com/pirate50off to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. During tax season, your personal info travels to a lot of places, between payroll, your tax consultant, and the IRS. If your W-2 gets exposed, that's just the ticket for identity thieves. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it guaranteed or your money back. Don't let identity thieves take you for a ride. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit lifelock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
I understand that was a very long quote, but despite my best efforts, I couldn't find a better way to tell that tale than Susan Montague. Her book, The Pirate Queen, which we have used frequently on this show, is really spectacular. She's got a true gift for narrative. She's able to tell the stories of real history in a way that is extremely readable. Her stories are really a page turner. If you're interested in this period, I really recommend picking one of her books up. So the Spanish had betrayed the English and taken an entire fleet and their crews hostage. Luckily, the Primrose was able to escape, the only shipping fleet that was able to do so. Perhaps even more luckily, they still had on board those 2 agents of the King of Spain. Under what I imagine was a fairly unpleasant questioning, they sang and they told everything they knew of King Philip's plans. More to the point, they had in their possession, both of them, direct written orders signed by the King of Spain telling exactly what was going to happen and giving undeniable proof of what had happened in the Bay of Biscay. This was exactly what Elizabeth needed. On July 1st, Elizabeth signed a decree granting Francis Drake and any English merchant who had suffered from the seizure of their ships the right of reprisal. Now, this wasn't a declaration of open war, but it was almost as good. It gave huge numbers of English sailors leave to attack Spanish shipping, or goods on land, anywhere in Spanish territory. It was free license to plunder at will. In addition, Elizabeth signed the Treaty of Nonsuch with the Netherlands. She agreed to send almost 7,000 troops and 1,000 cavalry to relieve the besieged city of Antwerp. There was also financial aid as well, amounting to almost a full quarter of all of the Netherlands' wartime costs. In return, Elizabeth was granted use of and dominion over the ports at Dimbril and Flushing. These were strategic staging grounds against the Spanish. Then, she gave Sir Francis Drake his orders, and she sent him to war. The seizure of the English ships on the Bay of Biscay at Galicia had changed everything. The English were forced to rush their timetable, and as preparations for the original plan to raid the West Indies were still incomplete, the fleet was understocked and underprepared. Still, Drake elected to leave with the entire fleet. His orders were to sail for the Galician coast, to free the imprisoned English, to take back their vessels, and to deliver a return blow to King Philip. After those orders were completed, Sir Francis intended to continue on with the plan to the West Indies in a capital. The Earl of Leicester approved. He wrote, quote, "That is the string that toucheth Philip indeed, for while his riches to the Indies continue, he thinketh he will be able with them to weary out all other parties, and I know by good means that he more feareth this action of Sir Francis than he ever did anything that hath been attempted against him." End quote. It was on September 14, 1585, that the largest Royal Naval fleet ever to set sail from English shores left port. The vessels included such illustrious names as the Elizabeth Bonaventure, the Aid, the Talbot Bark, the Galleon Leicester, the Sea Dragon, the White Lion, the Bark Bond, the Hope, the Bark Hawkins, the Galleon Duck, the Bark Bomber, the Thomas Drake, the Francis, the Elizabeth Drake, the Tiger, and the Primrose. They were captained by such illustrious names as Francis Drake, Edward Winter, William Hawkins, and Martin Frobisher, among many others. Now, there was some controversy over who exactly was going to be captaining some of these ships. Drake had very particular ideas on who these men should be, considering the last voyage he had planned had ended in such a disaster because of the meddling of English lords. He left in quite a rush. He wanted to leave some of these captains behind, and he needed to avoid any chance that Elizabeth might send a message to call him back to port. Now, in the rush, the fleet left more than half of their victuals, their food, behind. So, all of the captains were, at first, without orders, or really a rough outline at all of what the plan was. So after sailing into the Channel and getting away from Elizabeth's potential messengers, Drake called a halt and called all of his captains in to have a meeting. All of the captains gathered aboard the Elizabeth Bonaventure, the ship that Drake captained, and they discussed exactly what was going to happen from there on out. The very first issue that everybody had on mind was the lack of food, and Francis Drake had plans to address this. He believed that they had enough food on board to get them to Spain, where they could restock any provisions they needed. While this meeting of the sea captains was taking place, Philip of Spain received his very first news of the English fleet. His spies told him that the fleet was anchored off the Isle of Wight, which, in fact, they weren't, but he did know that they were in the Channel. Drake discovered something at this meeting, too. He discovered that he really didn't care for this sort of large command. In the past, he had been little more than a pirate captain, commanding a very small fleet of fiercely loyal men. Now he was a royal admiral, forced to confer with at least a dozen other proud and powerful noblemen before coming to any decision. He felt hindered by this rather than empowered. Now, back in England, Drake was known as Sir Francis Drake the Fortunate, and his luck on this voyage seemed to hold as well. They happened upon a Spanish vessel carrying fish, wine, and the usual other victuals. This vessel would keep the men fed and happy at least until they reached the coast of Spain. On the 27th of September, the fleet set anchor at the mouth of the Vigo River near Bayona, Spain. Drake sent one of the most important men in the fleet, the on-land military commander named Christopher Carlisle, with a force of soldiers. They were to take a number of pinnaces and land at Bayona. This fleet of pinnaces was met in the river by the Spanish governor, and in their boats, these two men conferred. Drake had sent Carlisle with one question, one request, and one demand. His question: is Spain at war with England? Now, this might sound like bravado or posturing on Drake's part, but it was likely a legitimate question. With the Spanish ambassador in exile, it's possible that Spain had declared war on England without notifying the English of it. But the governor replied that no, they were not at war. So then came the demand: release all English captives and English ships, or face the full might of the fleet's guns and armies. The governor allowed that the terms could be met, but he would need to speak with Sir Francis Drake directly. And in the request: allow us to trade for supplies until we are well stocked, and we will leave Spain in our wake forever. It was framed as a request, but the threat was really clear. Allow us to trade, or we will bring down the whole might of our fleet upon you and take your town and everything within it. The governor, though, tarried on this point. Trading with the English was very frowned upon by the Spanish authorities. He did, however, allow that since he was unsure whether or not he could grant this request, he would go ahead and release all of the English prisoners. Now, when Drake came ashore, he wanted first to meet with these sea captains and see that they had been actually released and see exactly what it had been like in the Spanish hands. Now that their freedom was secured, he sent his men to Leon. They entered the town, and for one night they plundered, pillaged, and pilfered without hindrance. Churches were desecrated or destroyed, homes were entered and ransacked, and taverns were certainly emptied of all their food and drink. However, for all the destruction, it appears that rape and murder were kept in check. Drake intended to scare them, not to galvanize the town against him, and it appears to have worked. The next day, he met with the governor, and they agreed that trade could proceed peaceably with the English. Now, the plunder had only amassed to about 6,000 ducats, most of which was quickly traded back to the local merchants for food and victuals. For some reason, though, the fleet waited at anchor. Perhaps they needed repairs to some of their vessels. A storm had hit while they were in the harbor. Perhaps some of the other captains believed that they were not still provisioned well enough to travel west across the Atlantic Ocean. Or perhaps there were other reasons. Drake did have other plans that he hadn't exactly told all of the captains about. Whatever the reason was, though, it cost the fleet. Their primary target on this voyage, aside from freeing the English, was to take the Spanish treasure float. They knew that it was coming, and they had plans to take it. And the Bay of Biscay, where they stayed, may have been a perfect place to wait. Unfortunately, while they dallied at anchor, the Spanish treasure fleet passed by, just over the horizon, completely oblivious to the English presence. This fleet carried millions of dollars in Spanish silver, and it passed less than 12 hours away from their grasp. It appears that they had been waiting for it on the coast of Galicia, and it's unclear exactly why they waited so long. It's likely that it was in fact a simple mistake. The Spanish and most of Catholic Europe had recently transitioned over to the Gregorian calendar, while the English and the other Protestant nations refused to transfer over to something that Pope Gregory was enacting. So the English were still 10 days behind the Spanish, and they would be for years and years to come. It's possible that whatever news Francis Drake had about the Spanish treasure fleet was in fact correct, but he was 10 days behind on his calendar from the Spanish. Regardless, this was a blow to the sailors when they learned just how close they had been to being rich men. So in mid-October, they left the coast of Spain and sailed for the Canary Islands, and then on to the Cape Verde Islands, where they arrived at the island of Palma on November 2nd. The fleet immediately began taking fire from the port. According to an anonymous sailor who left a journal on board, quote, "The first shot was made at our admiral, which went fair over. The second being likewise shot at her stake betwixt our general's legs, standing his galley with Captain Frobisher and C. Carlyle of the Captain George, and the other, the splinters of a plank where they stood, hurt George a little, but there was no more hurt done by it, it being a minion shot." End quote. What he's saying here is that this cannonball passed between Drake's legs while he was pacing on board with the other captains, and this has gone down in Drake's legend as a symbol of his luck and fearlessness in battle. However, the resistance from the island fort was too much for the English to bear, so they turned tail and ran. They raided all throughout the Cape Verde Islands, but they found really little or no plunder, and still even less food, water, or wood. Their last landfall on the islands at Santiago, several men visited a local curiosity, something they didn't see back in London, the hospital there. These men were impressed by the cleanliness and order, but they spoke of the 20 or so suffering inside from, quote, foul and filthy diseases, end quote. 5 days after sailing away from Santiago into the Atlantic, these foul and filthy diseases began to race throughout the crews of every vessel in the fleet. For the 2 weeks of the crossing of the Atlantic, this plague decimated the men. Every vessel reported at least 2 or 3 deaths per day. It finally passed 200 or 300 men, as many as 500 according to the Spanish records. Many more were permanently disabled by this illness. Upon reaching the Caribbean at the island of Dominica, Drake sent all of the sick men on board ashore, ostensibly so that the climate could help them heal. He sailed away to the northwest. It was on New Year's Eve, 1585, when the fleet arrived at Santo Domingo on the island of Hispaniola. On New Year's Day, the town was theirs. Santo Domingo was a city that had a rich past in the Caribbean. It had been one of the most prominent early settlements in the Spanish. It was a capital and a trading hub that had paved streets lined with tall, whitewashed mansions peppered by statues and fountains. Drake and his men expected a fantastic haul, but the luster of Santo Domingo had begun to fade. The trade and prosperity of the town had dried up in the last years, and despite the English having free reign in the town for days, they found almost no booty. So, in frustration, Francis Drake ordered captives taken in the town, and he attempted to ransom the city for a full 1,000,000 ducats. When the sheriff of the region countered that so much money simply did not exist in his jurisdiction, Drake began to burn the town down, one building at a time. In the end, they left Santo Domingo with nearly 25,000 ducats, a very paltry sum compared to what he believed the town was worth. After the fact, when the exploits of this raid were to be published about a year later in England, the events were enhanced in glory and valor. Only two of the mentions in that appear to be at least confirmed by the Spanish. Now, first, the English despoiled every church, abbey, or convent they found. From that same anonymous sailor journal, quote, "At our coming to the town's end, we burnt an abbey in which lay an old friar dead, who was killed by some of the soldiers which were disorderly." End quote. The second of these events, confirmed by the Spanish, occurred in a local audiencia building, kind of a town hall, where Drake found and removed a shield bearing the motto in Latin. It said, "Non sufficit orbis." Drake asked the local leaders to translate this message, but they lowered their eyes, embarrassed to do so, and being fearful, they declined. However, one man did speak Latin and did translate for them. The shield held the banner of King Philip II of Spain, and it said in his words, "The world is not enough." Drake resolved to return this item to the Queen, proof of Philip's, quote, "proud and unreasonable reaching vein of his," end quote. The governor of the town wrote back to Philip of Spain, describing Sir Francis Drake, El Drake, to him. He wrote, quote, "Drake is a man of medium stature, blond, rather heavy than slender, merry, careful. He commands and governs imperiously. He is feared and obeyed by his men. He punishes resolutely, sharp, relentless, well-spoken, inclined to liberality and to ambition, vainglorious, boastful, not very cruel." End quote. Back in Spain, Philip received word of this attack on his home shores, on his islands, and his New World possessions. He contacted the Duke of Parma, and he asked him formally to draw up plans for the invasion of England. The talk in every inn, household, and royal court in Europe, though, was still of Sir Francis Drake and his raid on the West Indies. The reports were nearly always exaggerated. Drake had taken Havana, conquered Cuba, freed 200,000 slaves, or, on the other hand, Drake had been killed in battle and soundly defeated. Now, while these rumors were inflated, they did hold a nugget of truth. Drake had not sacked Havana, however, he had considered it, and he did free slaves, but not nearly 200,000. Among the slaves he did free, some of them went to join their brothers in the wilderness, while still more joined up with Drake's crew, intending to take revenge upon the Spanish. Now, while the cash prize that he had taken had been so small, ransoming one of the oldest and most prestigious colonial possessions of Spain was a symbol of English strength in Spain. And instead of taking Havana and going towards Cuba, Drake elected to go south towards the Spanish mainland and the port at Cartagena. As the fleet neared the port, Drake landed a force of about 1,000 seasoned, armed, and armored troops under that man, Christopher Carlisle, about 4 miles up the beach from Cartagena. His fleet sailed near to the well-defended port there. They suffered a lot of withering fire from the fort. There was a chain barricade across the fort as well, and 2 galleys in the harbor holding them back, firing at them. Now, Drake's guns fired relentlessly, drawing all eyes from the town. They didn't really do much damage, but everybody was paying attention to the fleet and harbor. While he was unable to breach the defenses, it's doubtful that that was actually his purpose, because while Cartagena looked on at the battle in the harbor, those 1,000 Englishmen marched into town. The only resistance that Carlisle faced were some poisoned stakes that were blocking the path that were easily avoided, and an amateurish ambush by citizens of the town, not even trained soldiers. There were attacks from the trees and from the city walls by some natives that were allied to the Spanish, but their arrows just bounced harmlessly off the English armor, so there really weren't any impediment at all. And when the town had fallen and Carlisle sent word to him, Francis Drake focused all of his fire on the fort, bombarding it from sunup until sundown. After the sun set, every soldier manning the gun batteries fled in the night. The English took minimal casualties in taking Cartagena, but still, the plague continued to rip through them. The Spanish spoke of, quote, boatloads of English dead, unquote, and said that the English were burying their dead in secret to hide how reduced their numbers were. Much like at Santo Domingo, Drake entered into negotiations to ransom the town back to the Spanish. This time, he didn't expect as much. He demanded only 500,000 ducats, and that offer was summarily rebuffed. The local bishop, who was in on the negotiations, called Drake a pirate, at which point Drake flew into a rage. He insulted the bishop's pope and his king. The negotiations altered. Drake once again set to burning the town piece by piece, culminating in one of his ship's cannons being fired at their newly completed cathedral. It hit one of the arches that was a support to the rest of the cathedral and toppled the entire structure to the ground. Finally, the town agreed that they would give Drake 107,000 ducats to make the English leave, which Drake accepted. In both of these attacks on Santo Domingo and Cartagena, the records of the Spanish don't indicate that the English were as violent as one might expect when taking a town. They, of course, called Drake a pirate and a villain, which he was, but they also call him a gentleman and an honorable man. Now, yes, the English burned and looted, but as I said before, they didn't murder or rape. They warned the locals in advance before they burned their homes or their buildings. Drake even went so far as to befriend a man in whose home he was staying. Drake, when he found out that the man's wife had died, gave his wife a funeral with full honors. He had his own men dig her grave. They raised the Spanish flag, and he had his soldiers beat their muffled drums. There was a real respect that grew between this Spanish man and Sir Francis Drake, which showed because when Drake finally left Cartagena, he demanded only 5,000 ducats from the man instead of his regular 6,000 because he had been such a hospitable host. From Cartagena, the fleet sailed north. They went on to Cuba, took on some wood and water, and continued on, sailing north to St. Augustine. Drake called his war council together, and they decided that the fort at St. Augustine, and especially the watchtower there, were a serious threat to the English settlement at Roanoke, and they opened fire. For 2 days, the cannons rang until the men manning St. Augustine's defenses retreated. The fleet, the men on it at least, were weary of what had been happening. They didn't want to spend a long time in port ransoming a town, so they decided to go into St. Augustine and see what was there. Luckily, the soldiers defending the fort had left in such a hurry that they had failed to secure the thousands of pounds stored in the fort for a safe keep. The fleet moved on to Roanoke, where they delivered some supplies and news, and then they sailed back to England. Back in Spain, Philip raged. This devilish pirate, this dragon, had burned his cities, insulted him personally, and stolen his gold. In the Low Countries, this heretic Queen Elizabeth had installed her former lover, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, as the de facto king. Had his assassination of William of Orange been completely for naught? In France, Henry of Navarre, a Protestant, seemed ready to take the French throne. And on the British Isles, that heretic Queen Elizabeth executed his strongest Catholic ally there. She beheaded Mary Queen of Scots. Everything appeared to be slipping away from Philip. So he called once again for his military leaders, and he ordered plans for invasion to be sped up. The Pope, intending to help, published a papal bull condemning Elizabeth once again. This bull ordered all church proceeds taken in Spain and Portugal to go directly into the coffers of Philip, and presented a lineage from Edward III, the King of England, which named Philip the rightful Catholic ruler of the English and the English throne. In preparation to help Philip take that throne, the Lords Parma and Santa Cruz gathered ships into one of the largest gatherings ever seen. Unfortunately, when they returned to England, the news that Francis Drake and the other captains brought back was not good, especially for the families of all of those lost in the voyage. The sailors had lost at least 40% of their number due to that horrible sickness that tore through them. It was a failure in other ways as well, financial failure especially. The Crown had to come in and cover the shortfall to pay the soldiers and sailors their full wage because they had not made enough money for that voyage. Despite this ill news, though, the Queen was not entirely displeased. Her ships were still in good repair, none of them had been lost, and back home to guard the English shores, which is exactly where Elizabeth wanted them. And they had freed those English vessels and their crews and dealt that severe blow to King Philip. That blow was really taking its toll on Philip, who lay in bed, tormented both by the physical ailment, he had gout, but also by the psychological stress of what he saw as losing a war and perhaps losing the favor of his God. For a time, Drake was sent to Holland to give aid to the Dutch there, but quickly he was recalled. His plans to once again sail west and raid the Indies had to be put on hold. That amassing of ships, well, that was the worst kept secret in all of Europe. Everybody knew that they were gathering a massive armada for the invasion of England. Once again, Elizabeth turned to Drake. The Navy, the English Navy, was busy building as many ships as possible. They were amassing cannon and crews while the Winters and the Hawkins family constantly patrolled the English Channel. And Elizabeth turned to Drake and told him to gather his fleet. Once again, Drake was going to command from the ship the Elizabeth Bonaventure. The Crown also granted the fleet the ships the Golden Lion, the Rainbow, and the Dreadnought. They had a full complement of soldiers and cannon on board. This new fleet was supplemented by Drake and some of the other West Country investors. They had ships like the Drake, the Thomas, the White Lion, Hawkins, the Elizabeth, the Edward Bonaventure, and the Minion, along with a host of smaller yet still armed vessels and pinnaces. Back in Plymouth, Drake had some trouble finding enough men to crew these ships, though. At the last minute, hundreds of the men who had agreed to go on board deserted, wary of Drake's dangerous ventures and the shadow cast by his last outing. Sailors can be a superstitious lot, and so many had died on Drake's last voyage that this one was avoided by a lot of men. This angered Drake, and he sent a missive to the Crown asking that any of the men who had deserted this voyage be arrested. The Queen declined to send her sheriffs to arrest them, but she did send soldiers to fill the crews, and on April 2nd, 1587, the fleet departed. It appears that the Privy Council sent some last-minute orders to Francis Drake. Quote, "You shall forbear to enter forcibly into any of the said king's ports or havens, or to offer violence to any of his towns or shipping within harboring, or do any act of hostility upon the land." End quote. However, this command, for some reason, never seemed to reach Sir Francis Drake. On April 19th, near midday, the fleet anchored just off the Spanish coast. They waited near the port at Cadiz, which was a busy and well-defended harbor that was connected by river directly to the city of Seville. Drake called his captains in for conference. All along the Spanish and Portuguese coast, the Armada was gathering, but especially here. As yet, the ships from the farthest reaches of Spain's empire had not reached them, and all of the ships in port still lay at anchor. Nearly all of these ships were unmanned, and only a few merchant vessels were actually under sail, bringing necessary goods from ship to ship in the harbor to prepare for the invasion. Drake, against the wishes of many of the captains, ordered an immediate attack. At about 5 o'clock that evening, the English sailed toward the harbor. At first, The Spanish there assumed that it was the returning fleet of a friendly Spanish captain, and they sent a delegation to greet him. Drake, though, quickly dispatched them of this notion. He opened fire on the vessels. A couple of them were sunk, and the rest of them retreated to defend the harbor. Now, the Spanish galleys' guns, these smaller vessels, were no match for these English galleons, who fired well out of the Spanish range. The English sunk those two manned vessels, and still not properly actually in the harbor there, well, they took a 1,000-ton merchantman and then a 700-ton Biscayan galleon. They took 5 smaller merchant vessels, and then they took a galleon owned by Santa Cruz, the Spanish admiral himself. And these 8 ships had been fully ransacked and robbed of all of the valuables on board, including the victuals and wine. They were set ablaze and cut adrift. Throughout the night, then, the fort and towers fired at Drake's fleet, and whatever ships could be manned set their guns to fire against the English. However, it was really a poorly organized and ineffectual defense. The Duke, a man named Medina Sidonia, led reinforcements into the town. He had a contingent of both foot soldiers and cavalry, but they were unable to stop Drake from entering the harbor. All they could do was stop Francis Drake from entering the town, landing his men ashore, and taking the town. At dawn, the fleet sailed into the harbor at Cadiz. They took every ship that laid at anchor and all of the crews that were too slow or too foolish to escape, and then lashed all of those ships together, which made it easy for them to take all of the riches they found on board. But more importantly, to this mission at least, they took all of that which is required to outfit a navy. They took rope and tackle and tar and lumber and sail and any navigational instruments they may find. They did this so they could cripple the Armada before it even got started, and they could use all these goods to bolster the English Navy. It was really a well-thought-out plan. Drake did falter in one of his orders, though. The Queen had told him specifically that he was to burn any ship that he found in the harbor at Cadiz. And though Drake had all of these ships slashed together with plenty of tar and certainly plenty of fire, he failed to do so. Why? He exchanged the prisoners he had taken for gold, and the Duke of Medina Sidonia himself gifted Drake with a cask of wine and a basket of sweetmeats, and Drake left the harbor in a rush. Why? He left over 60 vessels in the harbor unharmed, if a bit lighter, in defiance of his direct royal orders. Why? Well, one possible answer is that Drake had taken some of those Spanish prisoners and had them questioned. One of these prisoners may have given up some sensitive information, perhaps even more valuable to Drake than burning ships. It appears that he had learned that Spain's second most accomplished admiral, a man named Juan Martinez de Recalde, sailed with a squadron that was half the size of Drake's and was, at this very moment, anchored off Cape St. Vincent. It's also possible that this smaller fleet was accompanying the Spanish treasure float, which was Drake's greatest lust in life. En route to get to the Cape, Drake encountered a fleet of tiny merchant vessels, really little more than fishermen's boats, and found on board what would actually wind up becoming perhaps the most valuable cargo that he would take this entire voyage. He found bound together bundles of barrel staves bound for Cadiz. I understand that this might not sound like much, but you have to understand that life on board a ship required many, many barrels filled with water. If you didn't have these iron barrel staves to hold the barrels together, you couldn't have water or wine, and your ships would be unable to sail, and it took time and money to produce. So perhaps the greatest delay that Drake effected this entire voyage was stealing these barrel staves. Still, though, barrel staves, while they were important, weren't exactly a rich prize. Drake needed a real haul, both to repay his investors and to line his own pockets. So he chased after Recalde, who had sailed away from the Cape. He was headed towards Lisbon, but Drake believed he could catch him. Unfortunately, the winds weren't in his favor, and Recalde managed to beat him there. Lisbon was far too well defended a port for the English to take, so Drake turned his attentions elsewhere. He took what was called the Sagres Castle, which had once, strangely enough, been the home of Prince Henry the Navigator. This was a symbolic victory, but not a rich one. Still, one monk did record, quote, They committed their usual feasts and drunkenness, their diabolical rampages and obscenities. They stole everything they found and then set the place on fire, having first committed 1,000 excesses and diabolical desecrations of the images of the saints like wicked heretics. End quote. Then, on June 1st, Sir Francis Drake's fortune changed once again for the better. He learned of a ship called the San Felipe, owned by Philip himself and carrying all of the goods from the Orient directly into Drake's clutches. It's said that the San Felipe was taken without a single shot being fired because her holds and her gun ports were too crammed with goods to fire any guns in her defense. On board, Drake found gold, he found silver, he found precious gems, ivory, silk, rich dyes, cinnamon, cloves, and pepper, all in all worth $32 million in modern money. With this haul, Drake was finally able to sail for home. It was around this time that Francis Drake enlisted perhaps one or maybe two men to write all of his letters and document all of his deeds. You see, Francis Drake needed better representation to both the Queen and the English people, and the results turned out to be ludicrous. You see, Drake was uneducated, he was poorly read, and he had really abysmal penmanship, and suddenly his correspondences were beautifully composed with allegory and reference to God, the Bible, and history. For example, he is reported to have said at Cadiz, when the wind turned to his favor, "The wind commands me away." Yeah, no, he didn't say that. Francis Drake was a sailor and a pirate, and he knew ships and violence, not poetry. Similarly, at this raid on Cadiz, he is reported to have claimed that he, quote, singed the King of Spain's beard, end quote, which was not true. That was actually said by the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire in reference to his own beard rather than King Philip's. Now, this new eloquent correspondence may have actually helped Francis Drake, though, when he returned to London. He found himself out of favor with the Queen, at least in official record, and defending some of his decisions during the raid on Cadiz. However, Drake showered Elizabeth with gifts, and he still had her ear. He may have failed to burn all of the vessels that he had been ordered to, but he had really delayed the invasion, and that was Elizabeth's need. He also brought news of Philip's true plans. He wrote to Lord Walsingham, quote, "I assure your honor, the like preparation was never heard of nor known, as the King of Spain hath and daily maketh to invade England. All possible preparations for defense are very expedient to be made. I dare not almost write into your honor of the great forces we hear the King of Spain hath in the straits. Prepare in England strongly, and most by sea. Stop him now, and stop him ever. Look well to the coast of Sussex." End quote. Drake begged again and again to be allowed another voyage, this time in force to go to Lisbon, where he could destroy the Armada before it even began sailing. The Crown, however, decided not to grant it. Finances in England were once again tight, and Elizabeth hesitated to back any venture that would take English vessels away from English shores. Philip, too, though, had suffered setbacks. In addition to the raid on Cadiz, he had been forced to call off the treasure fleets for the year, fearing that they would be taken by English pirates. They stayed in port in the Americas. And then his plans were dealt a truly terrible blow. His close friend, the Admiral Santa Cruz, died. Philip was forced to name the Duke Medina Sidonia, that man who was a hero of the raid on Cadiz, who had gifted Francis Drake wine and sweetmeats. He was forced to name him Admiral in the Spanish Armada. Medina Sidonia was a morose man, especially about the state of the Spanish Navy. He surveyed the fleet, and he found it lacking. They didn't have enough guns. They didn't have enough soldiers that were trained well, and the ships themselves were even sometimes in poor condition. He was forced to smuggle in at least 100 cast iron English cannon, something that the Spanish thought were so low quality they weren't even worth using, but he needed the guns, but still they wanted enough. The Spanish had little powder, they had less shot, and they had only a very few properly trained gunners. However, Philip refused to hear of these complaints. He believed that God was on his side. The Pope himself granted special indulgences for every Spaniard on the voyage, and when confronted with the possibility of bad weather, Philip said, quote, "Since it is all for his cause, God will grant us fair weather," end quote. As he lay in his sick bed and his admiral continued to bring complaints to him, his very last command to Medina Sidonia was, quote, sail, sail. The Spanish plan was simple. The Armada would sail into the channel. They would break the English naval defense there, and they would hold a landing site. Then, somewhere between 30 and 60,000 soldiers, under the command of the Duke of Parma, would sail from the Netherlands to England. They would sail upriver and take London in what they believed would be no more than 2 or 3 days. The sailors, though, in the Spanish fleet, well, they knew better. As the Spanish Armada was preparing to sail, one sailor wrote, quote, things hang in the balance. Please, God, let the events be for his cause, and may he assist us, as is so necessary. End quote. Another sailor, when he was speaking to a papal official, a papal nuncio, said to him, quote, the